Los Angeles, 1937. An elderly man, Hannon Fuller, suddenly learns a terrible truth about the world, but he can only tell one person, Douglas Hall. Fuller writes everything down on paper, then leaves money with a sleeping young girl, and goes down to the lobby of the Grand Hotel. Fuller understands that he should not have learned the truth, so now his life is in danger. He gives the bartender an envelope and asks him to be sure to pass this letter on to a man named Douglas Hall. When he arrives, Fuller leaves, and the curious bartender, Jerry, carefully opens the envelope and reads the letter. Returning home, Fuller lies down in bed next to his wife and leaves his body. 1999, Los Angeles. Fuller unloads from the simulation and returns to his own real world. He is the owner of the largest software development company and the creator of a virtual reality that imitates Los Angeles in 1937, the time of Fuller's youth. He goes to the nearest bar and calls Douglas from there. Fuller says that he discovered something incredible, and if anything happens to him, he left an envelope with evidence inside the simulation. Fuller does not have time to say whom exactly, because the door opens behind him. He greets the stranger as if he knows him, and together they leave the bar. A minute later, the stranger takes out a knife, and Fuller dies from multiple wounds. In the morning, Douglas goes into the bathroom and sees a bloody shirt in the laundry basket. He does not understand where it came from when suddenly Douglas gets a call from the police and is called to identify Fuller's body. At the hospital, the detective asks how well Douglas knew Fuller. Douglas replies that for the past 6 years he has been a leading programmer at Fuller's company, and during this time they became friends. Douglas and the detective arrive at Fuller's apartment and meet a girl there who calls herself his daughter. Jane stares at Douglas and he feels awkward. He feels like he's seen Jane before, but the girl says it's impossible because she's been living in Paris for a long time. Douglas is surprised because Fuller never mentioned his daughter or any heirs in general. Later, Douglas learns from his deputy Whitney that Fuller has been secretly visiting the simulation for a month now, although its testing hasn't been completed yet. Whitney also hears about Fuller's daughter for the first time, and Douglas decides to follow Jane. In the evening, the detective asks Whitney what kind of virtual reality is this and whether it can somehow help in the investigation. Whitney replies that, together with Douglas and Fuller, they spent 6 years creating the simulation. It's a well-developed and detailed world, inhabited by self-learning programs that live their own lives, regardless of the intervention of their creators. All programs look like people, live like people, and don't know that they are in a simulation. And although this is advanced technology, it hardly has anything to do with Fuller's death, since he died here in '99. Douglas finds out which hotel Jane is staying at and meets her in the lobby. Jane tells that Fuller called her 3 days ago and was extremely excited. He asked his daughter to come to the USA and help close the company, which surprises Douglas because he has never heard anything like that from Fuller. Later, Jane learns from a lawyer that shortly before his death, Fuller changed his will in favor of Douglas, and there is not a word about his daughter in it. Having learned this, the detective begins to suspect that Douglas is the killer, because now he will get richer by several $billion. Douglas has no alibi, and what's worse, he absolutely does not remember what he did that evening. The detective advises Douglas not to leave the city and says that before his death, Fuller still called from the bar and left a message for a friend on the answering machine, so Douglas hurries home to hear Fuller's last words. Douglas learns about the envelope and returns to the server room. Douglas explains to Whitney that he is a suspect in the murder, so he must go to the simulation and find this envelope. Fuller knew that he was in danger, which means that this letter must contain answers. Whitney opens a list of people with whom Fuller contacted in the simulation. Most of them work at the Grand Hotel, so Douglas intends to start the search from there. For security purposes, Whitney limits the stay in the simulation to 2 hours and initiates the transition of Douglas's consciousness into the body of a double from that time, John. The first thing Douglas sees around is people, security, and money. It means John works as a cashier at the bank. Douglas has only 2 hours, so he tells the manager that he feels bad and calls a taxi. He arrives at the Grand Hotel and soon meets the bartender, Jerry, a double of programmer Whitney. Jerry says that he never received any envelope, even though he often saw Fuller here. Then Douglas Hall says his name, but Jerry only repeats there is no letter. Douglas feels sick and goes to the toilet, where he loses consciousness. Douglas wakes up in 99, and John, meanwhile, finds himself in an unfamiliar place. He returns to the restaurant and asks Jerry what kind of hotel is this. Now he introduces himself as John and has no idea how he got here, so Jerry's surprise turns into suspicion. He talked to 2 different people. In 99, the bartender who served Fuller on the night of the murder comes to Douglas's office. They go out to the parking lot and the bartender says that he saw the one who called Fuller outside, and it was Douglas. The bartender demands $1 million for his silence, but is refused. Later, Douglas has dinner with Jane and tells her about a witness who will soon talk. Jane asks him not to dive into the simulation anymore because it can be harmful and dangerous for Douglas's consciousness. Later, they dance and both feel an invisible connection, as if they have known each other for a long time. At night, the police break into Douglas's house and take him to the station. There, the detective tells the suspect that Fuller wanted to close the company and stop the simulation, and the bartender witness who testified against Douglas was killed that same evening. According to the detective, the suspect was interested in these deaths, and he also shows a photo of Douglas's car seen near the bar on the night of the murder. Douglas is arrested, but Jane soon arrives at the police station. She tells the detective that Douglas was with her on the night of the witness's death, which means he is not the killer. Douglas is released, but he still remains the main suspect in the Fuller case. Douglas no longer knows whether he is a criminal or not, because he does not remember what he did on the evening of the murder. Evidence of his guilt is revealed faster than Douglas finds ways to justify himself. The only clue from Fuller remains inside the simulation, so Douglas has no way out. He needs to return to the 37th. At night, Whitney is not in the server room, so Douglas connects himself, but forgets to turn on the timer to exit the simulation. In John's body, Douglas regains consciousness and immediately goes to the house of Grierson, a copy of Fuller, who admits that he suffers from memory lapses, which means that it was to him that the transfer of consciousness took place. Grierson says that recently his wife has often scolded him for smelling with women's perfume, and recently he found a trunk in the apartment with a tuxedo and a top hat which he had never seen before. Douglas understands that his teacher and friend Fuller used the simulation to have fun and sleep with young girls. Together they arrive at the Grand Hotel and fragments of memories gradually return to Grierson. He names several dancers and then points to the bartender, Jerry. It was to him that Fuller gave the envelope to. Jerry notices John and goes on a break. In the utility room, Jerry threatens John with a revolver and wants to talk to Fuller again. Only the real one who gave the envelope. Jerry has read the letter in which Fuller revealed the secret: this world is not real, and it has boundaries. Jerry did not believe it at first, but then did what Fuller suggested. Jerry drove far out of town to a place where he would never go on a normal day and kept going straight, ignoring stop signs and various barriers. A few hours later, Jerry was left alone in the middle of the desert, and judging by the maps, a neighboring city should soon appear on the horizon. But this did not happen. Jerry got out of the car and saw something that scared him to the very depths of his soul. He realized that this world is a fake, so he demands that John show where reality is and that the creators leave his world alone, then shoots John in the hand with a revolver. At this moment, Whitney arrives at the server room and unloads Douglas from the simulation. He does not understand why Fuller needed to hide the obvious so carefully. Douglas already knows that this is a virtual reality of 1937. And its resources, like the world, are limited. Douglas is angry with himself because he generated such realistic people that they cease to differ from their creators. Douglas says that despite 6 years of work, he will close the project, and this news upsets Whitney. Later, the detective tells Douglas that the embassy has responded. Jane has never crossed the border and she is not Fuller's daughter. Who she is and what her goals are, Douglas does not understand, so he arrives at the hotel. But they say that Jane has recently left. Douglas asks the taxi driver who gave her a ride the address of the supermarket where Jane got out. He finds her working at the checkout, but she does not recognize Douglas. Her name is Natasha and she doesn't know any Jane. Douglas has seen something like this before, but in a simulation. He remembers Jerry's words about the desert and goes out of town to a place where on an ordinary day he would never go, bypassing prohibitory signs and barricades. Soon, he arrives in a deserted place and sees the edge of the world, and behind it an unrendered wireframe model of the 3D world. Fuller wrote that the world is not real, just not the 37th, but their own, the 99th. Later, Jane comes to her senses at the supermarket checkout and immediately calls Douglas. They meet at the company's office, and Douglas asks how many other such worlds exist. Jane replies, thousands, but this is the only one where people have created a simulation within a simulation. And this overloads the world, so Douglas, like Fuller, saw undrawn textures. When all of Los Angeles finds out about this world will plunge into chaos and risks disappearing. Douglas experiences the same terrible emotions as Jerry. They are puppets that can be turned off with one button, which means everything around loses its meaning. Douglas considers himself a soulless program, so he advises Jane to build a relationship with his prototype from the real world. Jane says that their mutual sympathy and invisible connection were formed for a reason. In the real world, she is married to Douglas' prototype, David, and it was he who killed Fuller, downloading himself into Douglas. David imagined himself to be a god, playing with people's lives in a simulation, and the further he went, the more cruel he became. Killing, he began to get pleasure, and his attitude towards Jane in the real world also deteriorated. David recently said that he would kill Jane because she sympathizes with Douglas. He does not understand how she can take this seriously, because Douglas is nothing more than a dream. Jane says that for her, Douglas has long become her reality in which she would like to live. Whitney is worried that he will not convince Douglas and tomorrow he will turn off the simulation forever. Whitney wants to try to at least once look inside the world he has created for 6 years, so he downloads his consciousness into his copy, the bartender Jerry. He comes to his senses, sitting in a car, and a policeman approaches him and demands to open the trunk, from which a strange sound is coming. They see John tied up, and the policeman immediately takes out a gun, but does not have time to detain Whitney because he takes a step back and gets under the wheels. His death does not allow the correct transition of consciousness back, so the operation is interrupted, and Jerry returns to the year 99. For 5 minutes he plays with the automatic door, and this behavior seems strange to the guard, so he reports it to Douglas. Later, in front of the server room, he notices a stunned guard and an empty holster. But Douglas is no longer afraid. He meets Jerry, who is still fascinated by the technology of the real world, and calls Douglas a god. But in response, Douglas disappoints Jerry. This world is also a simulation, and this is what Fuller said in the letter about. Then Jerry takes out a gun and says that they need to go higher to the real world. But Douglas meets the threat phlegmatically. They are both puppets, stuck here. Then Jerry asks to show the place where he was born, the server room, and both men get into the elevator. While they go up, David loads into Douglas and kills Jerry. David returns to the apartment and sees Jane kissing him. He understands that Jane also spends time in the simulation for her own pleasure. Only for David it is murder, and for her it is betrayal of her husband with his copy, Douglas. David is furious, and Jane realizes that in front of her is not Douglas. She runs to the elevator and goes down to the first floor of the skyscraper, but soon David catches up with her and takes out a gun. Shot, David falls, and Jane sees behind her a detective who has managed to come to her aid. He smiles and asks for this. He will probably be disconnected now. But nothing happens. The detective asks only one thing: when Jane returns to her reality, let her tell everyone to leave this world alone, and she agrees. As in the case of Whitney, David's consciousness did not have time to return to its owner, so Douglas wakes up in the real world of 2024. By his cautious gait and puzzled look, Jane understands that Douglas is in front of her. Together they go out onto the veranda, and Jane shows Douglas the beautiful, real world of 2024. An invisible finger presses a button, and the image on the screen disappears.